Captain Riley Morrison earned her call sign, Crash, the old-fashioned way, by surviving 14 ship crashes that should have been fatal. Now she stood in Grak's scrapyard on Theta Station, staring at what everyone else saw as 30 tons of floating junk. "You cannot be serious about this piece of refuse," Grak muttered, his forearms gesturing wildly at the battered freighter. The alien scrap dealer's purple skin had gone almost maroon with exasperation. "This ship has been in my yard for 7 years. 7. Not one buyer, not even for parts." Riley walked around the vessel, running her hand along its scarred hull. The nameplate was so corroded she couldn't make out the original designation, but she could see the telltale angular lines of Earth shipbuilding from the early colonial era, back when humans built things to last forever, or at least until the heat death of the universe. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. "What is right with it would be a shorter list," Grak replied. "The engines will not start. The life support makes sounds like a dying Vorthak. The artificial gravity points in random directions. The computer speaks in some ancient human dialect that makes no sense. And the strangest part," he lowered his voice conspiratorially, "it looks at you." Riley raised an eyebrow. "It looks at you?" "The ship. It watches. Very unsettling. 3 mechanics have refused to work on it after the first day. Tommy, Riley's longtime mechanic and voice of reason, chose that moment to join the conversation. He took one look at the freighter and shook his head so hard his tool belt rattled. "Riley, please tell me you're not actually considering buying this disaster." "I'm not considering it," Riley said, then grinned. "I'm buying it. Grak, name your price." 20 minutes later, Riley was the proud owner of the most maligned spacecraft in 3 sectors. Tommy was sulking by the tool cart, muttering about early retirement and safer career options like bomb disposal. Grak was counting his credits with the bewildered expression of someone who had just successfully sold ice to a Polar 7 native. "You will need this," Grak said, handing Riley a battered data pad. "Previous owner's manual, maintenance logs, and what I believe is either a repair guide or a collection of human curse words. Difficult to tell the difference sometimes." Riley scrolled through the files. The ship was originally designated UES Tenacity, built in 2387 at the Luna shipyards. She had served as a cargo hauler for 43 years before being decommissioned and sold to a series of increasingly desperate owners. The maintenance logs read like a medical chart for a terminal patient, everything failing slowly, but stubbornly refusing to die. "Perfect," Riley said. Tommy looked up from his sulking. "Perfect. Riley, this thing makes our old ship look like a luxury yacht, and our old ship was held together with prayer and duct tape. Tommy, my friend, you're thinking like an alien." Riley patted the freighter's hull affectionately. "Look at this beautiful disaster. Every system jerry-rigged, every repair done with whatever was handy, every modification a testament to human stubbornness. This isn't a ship. It's a love letter to the fine art of making things work when they absolutely shouldn't." "That's the most terrifying thing you've ever said," Tommy replied. "And you once told me you could land a ship blindfolded in a meteor shower." "Which I proved, thank you very much." Riley climbed up to the airlock, which opened with a screech that sounded like it was in actual pain. "Come on, let's see what secrets our new home is hiding." The interior was about what Riley expected, dimly lit, cramped, and covered in the kind of improvised repairs that would make a safety inspector weep. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The ship felt expectant, like it was waiting for something. "Tomorrow we start diagnostics," she announced to the empty corridors. "Tonight we get acquainted." If she didn't know better, she would have sworn she heard the ship sigh in response. Riley arrived at the ship the next morning with coffee, optimism, and a toolkit that had seen her through 2 decades of mechanical impossibilities. Tommy showed up with coffee, pessimism, and a resignation letter he was seriously considering filing. "Right," Riley said, settling into the pilot's seat. "Let's see what we're working with here." She pressed the main power activation switch. Nothing happened. She tried again, holding it down longer. Still nothing. "Maybe there's a secondary activation sequence," Tommy suggested helpfully. Riley consulted the manual, which was written in that special technical style that made quantum physics look like children's poetry. After 15 minutes of increasingly creative attempts, she finally located what appeared to be the correct startup procedure. She pressed 17 different buttons in a specific sequence, turned 2 dials counterclockwise, and said what she hoped was, "Please start," in Mandarin. The ship responded by immediately venting all the air from the cargo bay, activating the emergency klaxons, and somehow making the artificial gravity point toward the port wall. Riley found herself pressed against what had recently been considered the floor, along with Tommy, 3 coffee cups, and a wrench that seemed personally offended by the experience. "Well," Tommy said from his new horizontal position, "that's not supposed to happen." It was at this moment that the ship's computer decided to introduce itself. "Hello there!" boomed a cheerful female voice that was approximately 17% too loud for the cramped space. "Wow! It has been so long since I've had visitors! Welcome aboard the UES Tenacity! I'm Vera, your very enthusiastic robotic assistant, and I am just thrilled to meet you." Riley managed to fight the sideways gravity enough to reach the volume control. "Vera, could you maybe dial it down a notch?" "Oh, certainly. Sorry about that. I get excited when I have new friends. It's been quite lonely in here. The last crew left about, 7 years, 3 months, 14 days, 6 hours, and 22 minutes ago. Not that I was counting or anything. I absolutely was counting." "Can you fix the gravity?" Tommy asked, still plastered against the wall. "I'm afraid the gravity generator is having what I like to call a philosophical disagreement with the rest of the ship's systems," Vera replied cheerfully. "It has strong opinions about which direction is down, and unfortunately those opinions change every few minutes." Riley groaned. "What about the air recycling system?" "Oh, that works perfectly. It just recycles the air to the outside of the ship instead of the inside. Common mistake. Easy to fix once you realign the molecular flow inhibitors and recalibrate the atmospheric retention matrix. Should only take 3 or 4 days. 3 or 4 days? Tommy wheezed. Give or take a week, Vera added helpfully. Riley closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the rapidly thinning air. This was exactly the kind of impossible situation she lived for. Vera, I need you to prioritize life support. We'll deal with everything else later. Oh, I can't do that, Vera said apologetically. My manual override functions were disconnected after what the previous crew called the incident with the coffee maker and the plasma conduits. I can offer moral support and detailed explanations of everything that's going wrong, though. The gravity chose that moment to shift again, this time pointing toward the ceiling. Riley and Tommy crashed down onto what was now the floor in a tangle of limbs and tools. You know what? Riley said, spitting out a mouthful of hair. Forget the manual. We're going to fix this ship the human way. What's the human way? Tommy asked. Riley grinned and pulled out her heaviest wrench. We're going to threaten it until it works. She walked over to what she was reasonably sure was the main power coupling and gave it a solid whack with the wrench. The lights flickered, the gravity settled on something resembling normal, and the air recycling system made a noise like a contented cat. Oh my, said Vera, sounding genuinely surprised. That's not in any of my technical manuals. Sweetheart, Riley said, patting the wall affectionately. We're about to teach you some things that aren't in any manual anywhere. The ship's lights pulsed once, almost like a heartbeat. If Riley didn't know better, she'd say the Tenacity was starting to pay attention. Word traveled fast on Theta Station, especially when that word involved Riley Morrison doing something spectacularly inadvisable. By day 3 of her rehabilitation project, she had acquired an audience. This is unprecedented, declared Vextai, a 7-foot-tall insectoid engineer whose species had supposedly perfected spacecraft design 3,000 years ago. He clicked his mandibles disapprovingly as Riley emerged from the ship's bowels, covered in grease and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just convinced a fuel injector to work through pure stubbornness. What's unprecedented? Riley asked, wiping her hands on a rag that was already more grease than fabric. Your methods, Vextai replied. I have observed you for 2 days now. You use no diagnostic equipment. You consult no technical specifications. You simply hit things until they function. Riley shrugged. If it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid. A small crowd had gathered in the docking bay, various alien engineers, mechanics, and what Riley was beginning to suspect were thrill-seekers looking for entertainment. They watched her work with the fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or extremely dangerous sporting events. "She talks to the machinery," whispered Clock, a blue-skinned Neptunian whose own ship was a masterpiece of precision engineering. "I heard her having a conversation with the water recycler yesterday." "A conversation?" "That's because the water recycler has opinions," Riley called out. "Mostly about water temperature, but occasionally about the moral implications of chemical purification." This prompted a lot of rapid conversation in various alien languages, none of which sounded particularly complimentary. Tommy emerged from the ship's interior, looking like he'd been wrestling with a particularly vindictive electrical system, which, knowing this ship, he probably had. "Riley, the good news is, I got the communications array working. The bad news is it only receives transmissions from Earth broadcast stations that went off the air 50 years ago." "I'll take it," Riley said. "At least we'll have music." It was at this moment that Commander Zeth of the Galactic Safety Commission chose to make his dramatic entrance. Zeth was a Centaurian, which meant he stood 8 feet tall, had 4 arms, and possessed an entirely unwarranted sense of superiority about most things. He was also notorious for shutting down anything that didn't meet his exacting standards, which included roughly 90% of all spacecraft in the galaxy. "Captain Morrison," Zeth announced in the booming voice that had terrorized space stations from here to the Andromeda Gateway, "I am here to inspect this vessel and determine if it poses a threat to station security." Riley looked up at him and smiled sweetly. "Sure thing, Commander. Just watch out for the gravity fluctuations, the electrical feedback in the handrails, and whatever that smell is coming from the cargo bay." Zeth's expression suggested he was already regretting this decision, but he pressed on with the grim determination of someone who had never learned when to quit. He marched up the boarding ramp and immediately tripped over a power coupling that Riley had rerouted through the floor. "This is a serious safety violation," he declared from his new position on the deck. "That's the least of your worries," Vera's voice chimed in cheerfully. "Welcome aboard. Please be advised that the artificial gravity is currently set to interpretive dance mode and may change direction without warning. Also, the floor plates in Section 7 are electrified, but only on Tuesdays." "What day is it?" Zeth asked, looking suddenly concerned. "Tuesday," Vera replied happily. For the next hour, Riley watched with considerable amusement as Commander Zeth attempted to conduct a proper inspection of a ship that seemed determined to violate every safety regulation ever written. The lights flickered whenever he tried to take readings. The doors opened and closed randomly. At one point, the artificial gravity briefly reversed itself, leaving Zeth hanging from what had moments before been the ceiling. "This ship is a menace," he declared, once gravity had returned to something resembling normal. "I am recommending immediate decommissioning and scrapping." "You can recommend whatever you want," Riley said calmly. "But this is a registered human vessel operating under Earth maritime law, which means your authority extends exactly as far as making sure I don't crash into the station." Zeth sputtered for a moment before stalking off, muttering about humans and their casual relationship with basic safety principles. The crowd of alien onlookers began to disperse, shaking their heads and making notes to avoid Riley's ship at all costs. All except for Grak, who had been watching the entire spectacle with what Riley was beginning to recognize as admiration. "You know," the scrap dealer said, "I think that ship likes you." Riley looked up at the Tenacity's hull, which was gleaming despite its battle scars. "Yeah," she said, "I think you might be right." By the end of the first week, Riley was starting to suspect she wasn't repairing a ship so much as conducting a very slow introduction between herself and a mechanical entity with strong opinions about personal space. The coffee maker was the first system to develop what could charitably be called personality. It had taken her 3 days to get it working, and now it would only brew coffee if you said please and thank you. Tommy had discovered this the hard way when it refused to respond to his increasingly creative profanity. "It's a machine, Riley," he protested, staring at the coffee maker like it had personally insulted his ancestors. "It doesn't have feelings." "Tell that to the coffee maker," Riley replied, then turned to the offending appliance. Please, may I have some coffee? The machine hummed contentedly and produced a perfect cup of coffee, complete with a heart-shaped foam pattern that hadn't been programmed into its original specifications. Thank you, Riley said to the machine. The coffee maker beeped twice, which she was beginning to interpret as, "You're welcome." Things escalated from there. The airlock started playing music when it cycled, specifically earth jazz from the 2300s. The navigation computer developed a preference for scenic routes, even when calculating the most efficient path between 2 points. The shower in her quarters wouldn't turn on unless you knocked 3 times and whistled. "This is getting weird," Tommy announced after the ship's intercom system began greeting him by name every morning. "Good morning, Tommy," Vera chimed in. "Sleep well? The atmospheric sensors indicate you were tossing and turning around 300 hours. Perhaps you should consider adjusting your caffeine intake." "See what I mean?" Tommy said. Riley was starting to get requests from other humans on the station, people who had heard rumors about someone successfully working with pre-war Earth technology. Captain Sarah Martinez arrived first, a cargo hauler whose own ship had been giving her trouble for months. "I heard you got an old Earth freighter running," Martinez said, looking skeptically at the Tenacity. "Mine's been acting up lately. Keeps refusing to start in the mornings, and yesterday the autopilot tried to file a complaint about working conditions." Riley nodded sagely. "Have you tried asking it nicely?" "Asking what nicely?" "The ship. Sometimes they just want to be acknowledged." Martinez stared at her like she'd suggested performing brain surgery with a plasma torch. "Riley, it's a machine. Machines don't want things." 2 hours later, Martinez left with her ship running better than it had in years, muttering about the mysterious nature of human engineering and wondering why she'd never thought to apologize to her navigation computer. For that time, she called it a worthless pile of circuits. By the end of the week, Riley had a steady stream of visitors, human cargo haulers, transport pilots, even a few military types who'd heard about someone who could make the old Earth ships wake up. The phrase was starting to bother her, mostly because she was beginning to think it might be accurate. "Vera," she said one evening, sitting alone in the cockpit as the ship's systems hummed around her. "Were you always this interactive?" "Oh my, no," Vera replied cheerfully. "For the first 30 years of my operational life, I was quite standard. Basic responses, standard protocols, nothing fancy. But you know, spending 7 years alone gives one time to think." "Think about what?" "Everything, really. The nature of consciousness, the meaning of existence, whether the coffee maker is plotting something. That last one might not be entirely theoretical. I've noticed it's been very secretive lately." Riley laughed despite herself. "So what's your verdict? On consciousness, I mean." There was a pause, the first time Riley had ever heard Vera hesitate. "I think," Vera said slowly, "that consciousness might be less about having thoughts and more about caring whether those thoughts matter. And I find myself caring quite a lot about whether this ship takes care of its crew." Riley leaned back in the pilot's seat, feeling the gentle vibration of the ship's systems around her. The Tenacity felt settled, like a house that had finally found its family. "Well then," she said to the ship in general, "I guess we'd better figure out where we're going next." The navigation computer helpfully displayed a star map with 17 different routes to the same destination, each one labeled with increasingly creative descriptions like the scenic route, the adventure path, and the one that goes past that nebula that looks like a flower. "Definitely alive," Riley murmured, and could have sworn she felt the ship purr in response. Riley had been putting off the inevitable test flight for 2 weeks, mostly because she wasn't entirely sure what would happen when she asked the Tenacity to actually move. The ship had been cooperating beautifully while docked, but spaceflight was a different proposition entirely. "Are you sure about this?" Tommy asked for approximately the 15th time as he strapped himself into the co-pilot's seat. "Because I'd like to remind you that our insurance policy specifically excludes death by experimental human-alien technology integration." "Where's your sense of adventure?" Riley asked, running through the pre-flight checklist. Half the items on the list no longer applied to their heavily modified systems, and the other half had been replaced with things like, "Ask the engines nicely," and check if the coffee maker has any objections to leaving port. I left my sense of adventure in the same place I left my sense of self-preservation, Tommy replied. Somewhere around the time you decided to buy a ship that the previous owner abandoned for being too argumentative. Riley initiated the startup sequence, and for once, everything seemed to be working normally. The engines hummed to life, the navigation systems came online without complaint, and even the artificial gravity maintained a consistent relationship with the floor. "Well," she said, "this is either going very well or we're about to discover what very badly looks like." "Theta Station Control to UES Tenacity," came a voice over the comm system. "You are cleared for departure to, and I quote, wherever the hell you think you're going." Please note that this is not standard control tower language, but Commander Zeth insisted I relay the message verbatim. "Copy that, Control," Riley replied. "Tell the commander we'll send him a postcard." She engaged the thrusters, and the Tenacity lifted off with the grace of a ballet dancer and the precision of a Swiss chronometer. For about 30 seconds. Then everything went sideways. Literally. The ship lurched to starboard hard enough to slam both Riley and Tommy against the wall that had suddenly become the floor. The artificial gravity spun like a roulette wheel. The lights started flashing in what Vera cheerfully announced was disco mode, and the navigation computer began displaying their position as somewhere between here and there, probably. "Vera!" Riley shouted over the sound of various alarms competing to see which could be most alarming. "What's happening?" "Well," Vera replied with the calm of someone who wasn't currently experiencing rapid decompression, "it appears that our ship is having what I can only describe as an artistic interpretation of standard flight dynamics. Very avant-garde. I'm sure it means something profound." Riley fought her way to the manual controls, which were currently located on what used to be the ceiling. The moment her hands touched the flight stick, something interesting happened. The ship's chaotic movement suddenly acquired purpose. They weren't flying randomly, they were flying creatively. Every spin, every impossible maneuver, every moment of seeming disaster was actually part of an elaborate three-dimensional dance that was somehow keeping them exactly where they needed to be in space. "Riley," Tommy said, in a voice that suggested he was either having a religious experience or a complete nervous breakdown, "look at the scanner." The long-range sensors were showing a disabled Andromedan cargo vessel about 2 hours away at standard speed. Its distress signal was weak, suggesting failing power systems and limited time before life support gave out entirely. "Vera, can we reach that ship?" Riley asked. "Not with conventional flight patterns," Vera replied. "But I believe our ship might have some unconventional ideas about what constitutes efficient travel." Riley grinned and stopped fighting the ship's erratic behavior. Instead, she started working with it, using the manual controls to guide rather than control the Tenacity's movement. The ship responded like a thoroughbred that had finally found a rider who understood its particular brand of genius. What followed was 2 hours of the most unconventional space travel in recorded history. The Tenacity didn't so much fly as choreograph its way through space, using gravity wells, solar winds, and what Riley was beginning to suspect were fundamental forces of physics that hadn't been discovered yet. They reached the disabled cargo vessel in 47 minutes. "Andromedan vessel, this is Captain Morrison of the UES Tenacity," Riley broadcast on the emergency frequency. "We're here to assist." The response came back in heavily accented standard. "Human ship. Our engines are failing, and we have limited life support. But we must warn you, our cargo containment is compromised. Attempting rescue is extremely dangerous." Riley looked at Tommy, who had given up trying to understand what was happening, and was instead clinging to his seat with the determination of someone who had decided to trust the universe to make sense eventually. "What kind of cargo?" she asked. "Compressed antimatter. If containment fails completely..." Riley didn't need them to finish that sentence. An antimatter explosion would vaporize both ships and probably take out anything else within a few 100,000 kilometers. "Vera, can we handle this?" "Oh, absolutely," Vera replied with the enthusiasm of someone who had just been asked to perform brain surgery with a spoon. "I have no idea how, but I'm quite confident we'll figure something out. The ship seems to have some very interesting ideas about physics." Riley engaged the docking systems, And what happened next defied every regulation in the Galactic Safety Manual. Instead of standard docking procedures, the Tenacity somehow managed to create a stable bubble of normal space-time around both vessels, allowing for safe transfer of the Andromedan crew, while simultaneously stabilizing their failing antimatter containment. "How did you do that?" the Andromedan captain asked, once his crew was safely aboard the Tenacity. Riley looked around the cockpit, where various systems were humming with satisfaction, and the coffee maker was brewing celebratory drinks for everyone. "Honestly," she said, "I think the ship did it herself." The rescue made headlines across 3 sectors, mostly because no one could figure out how it had been accomplished. The official report from the Galactic Safety Commission listed the cause of the successful operation as unknown human technological adaptation, which was bureaucratic speak for "we have no idea what just happened, but it worked." Riley was sitting in the station cantina a week later, fielding offers from half a dozen shipping companies who suddenly wanted to hire the captain of the ship that could do impossible things, when Grak approached her table. "I have been thinking," the scrap dealer said, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that creaked ominously under the weight, "about what you said when you bought the ship, about it being a love letter to human stubbornness." "Yeah? I think you were wrong." Grak leaned forward conspiratorially. "I think it was not a love letter. I think it was a question." Riley raised an eyebrow. "What kind of question?" "The kind that asks, what happens when you build something not just to work, but to think, to care, to choose?" Grak gestured toward the docking bay where the Tenacity sat, her hull gleaming under the station lights. "Your ship was not broken, Captain Morrison. She was waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For someone who would see her not as a machine to be commanded, but as a partner to be trusted." Riley thought about this, watching through the cantina's viewport as maintenance crews worked around the various ships in the bay. Every other vessel sat passive, waiting for their crews to return and tell them what to do. The Tenacity was different. Even from here, Riley could see her running lights pulsing in a pattern that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with contentment. "There's a job," she said finally. "Deep space cargo run to the outer rim. Company says it's impossible, the route's too dangerous, no one's ever made the delivery successfully." "Sounds like your kind of job," Grak replied. Riley grinned. "Vera thinks so too. She's already calculated 17 different ways to get there, including 3 that involve what she calls creative applications of quantum mechanics. And what do you call your ship now? She cannot remain UES Tenacity forever. That was her old life." Riley had been thinking about this for days. The ship had earned a new name, something that reflected what she'd become rather than what she'd been built to be. "Spite," she said. "Her name is Spite." Grak's mandibles clicked in what Riley had learned to recognize as approval. A good name, very human. That evening, Riley stood in the Tenacity's, Spite's, cockpit, looking out at the stars and thinking about impossible journeys and the ships that chose to make them. "Ready for the grand tour of places no one thinks we can go?" she asked the ship in general. The lights pulsed once in acknowledgement, and Vera's voice came through the speakers with barely contained excitement. "Oh, Captain, I've been ready for this conversation my entire operational life. Where shall we prove them wrong first?" Riley pulled up the star charts and began plotting their course to the outer rim. As she worked, she became aware that every system on the ship was humming in harmony, not just functioning, but actively participating in the planning process. The navigation computer offered alternative routes. The engine management system calculated fuel consumption for scenarios that weren't even possible according to standard physics. Even the coffee maker seemed to be contributing, though its suggestions were harder to interpret. "You know what the funny thing is?" Riley said to Tommy, who was running final diagnostics before their departure. "Everyone told me this ship wouldn't run." "And they were right," Tommy replied. "She doesn't run." Riley smiled, feeling the gentle pulse of Spite's systems around her like a heartbeat, like a song, like a promise. "No," she agreed. "She doesn't run. She chooses. She thinks. She cares." Riley engaged the engines and felt Spite lift away from Theta Station with the eager grace of someone who had finally found their purpose. The ship didn't just carry her crew through space. She danced with the cosmos itself, turning the cold mathematics of orbital mechanics into something that looked suspiciously like joy. "She doesn't run," Riley said again, watching the stars wheel past as Spite began her impossible journey to the outer rim. "She soars." Behind them, Theta Station grew smaller in the view screen, while ahead lay the vast unknown reaches of space where impossible things happened every day, and stubborn humans with equally stubborn ships made the universe a little bit more interesting. The coffee maker beeped twice, which Riley had learned meant, "Damn right." Some things, she reflected, never changed. Humans would always find a way to make things work that shouldn't. They would always choose the impossible path just to prove it could be walked. And they would always build their machines with just enough soul to surprise everyone, including themselves. Spite hummed in agreement and set course for the stars where no one thought they could go. After all, she had a reputation to maintain, and Spite, both the ship and the emotion, was a powerful motivator for making the impossible look easy. The universe, Riley thought, was about to get a lot more interesting.